The Galactic court hung like a cathedral in vacuum, and the narrator told how Elena Ward knelt beneath lights that burned like verdicts. Archon Vale said, Species 3107 stands condemned. Marcus Hale said, Accept necessity, Elena. Elena Ward said, Name the crime beyond fear. The chamber screen stitched wars into a tapestry of accusation, while fleets drifted like iron halos. Admiral Jonah Pike said, Compliance spares a remnant. Lyraean said, Not all judgment is truth. The judges droned, and the hush felt engineered. Elena tasted metal and remembered ashes. Archon Vale said, Extinction restores balance. The narrator noted billions of eyes, none blinking, as shackles pressed bone to stone. A whisper slipped from a seam of shadow and curled around her breath. Shade Primus said, They are not judging acts, they are pruning futures. Elena lifted her head and let silence answer contempt. The court inhaled as if to drown her voice. Elena Ward said, We are guilty of scars but innocent of surrender. The narrator traced the silence that followed the sigil's blaze while Elena Ward counted heartbeats against the magnet floor. Archon Vale said, Your species speaks only in aftermath. Marcus Hale said, Use dignity to negotiate the end. Elena remembered a doorway of fire and the name that survived it. Lyraean said, There is a ledger beyond numbers. Elena Ward said, If balance is your creed, weigh mercy. The chamber shifted, and distant engines murmured like a tide. Jonah Pike said, Survival requires obedience. A courier droned past, small as a sting, bearing new evidence like gleaming bait. The narrator marked how guilt was stacked with artful hands. Archon Vale said, Confession reduces duration. Elena kept her eyes on the fleet and let shame become a shield. A whisper threaded the seams again. Shade Primus said, Endings edited become origins. Elena Ward said, I will not name a lie as ours. The narrator followed the procession of evidence as if it were a funeral carried by light. Archon Vale said, Observe accumulated harm. Panels bloomed with cries and fire that did not belong to every truth. Elena Ward said, Show the hands that framed this. Marcus Hale said, Deflection proves weakness. A child's face surfaced and dissolved like breath on glass, and the ache in her chest sharpened. Lyraean said, Context is a body, not a bone. Jonah Pike said, Stability demands closure. The court tasted bloodless certainty, and Elena tasted the memory of rain. Archon Vale said, Final motion approaches. The whisper curled again, closer now. Shade Primus said, They fear the ember that refuses instructions. Elena Ward said, We learn to walk through ash without forgetting names. The narrator described how the chamber inhaled as a final exhibit assembled, a scaffold of claims meant to bind a planet. Archon Vale said, Sentence will be executed. Marcus Hale said, This is mercy measured. Elena Ward said, Mercy without memory is erasure. A tremor crawled the floor as ships adjusted formation. Lyraean said, Doubt is not disorder. Jonah Pike said, Delay invites ruin. The screens flickered, and for a breath the lies exposed their stitching. The whisper stepped out of shadow and left a chill like eclipse. Shade Primus said, Survive tomorrow, and you will see the seam. Elena Ward said, Then I will reach it. The narrator let the moment settle like soot before a storm. The narrator noted that the court recessed without kindness, and guards led Elena Ward to a cell whose walls remembered screams. A single field lamp hummed. Elena Ward said, Name the distance between guilt and design. The ceiling dripped cold, counted like years she had not lived. Archon Vale said, At dawn you will be measured. Marcus Hale said, Sleep while endings are still yours. Lyraean said, Hold fast to the small fire. The whisper finally settled on the floor beside her like a second shadow. Shade Primus said, If you breathe through what comes, the mask will slip. Elena closed her eyes and rehearsed every name she refused to surrender. The narrator marked the hour as if writing on bone. The narrator returned to the cell where the lamp hummed like a patient heart, and Elena Ward mapped her scars as an atlas of choices. She remembered a kitchen window cracked by winter, and a laugh that survived one more night. Elena Ward said, "If shame is a chain, I will file it with names." The floor kept its chill like a covenant, and the walls kept their stories in mute relief. Marcus Hale said, "Dignity without outcome is theater." The memory of smoke braided with rain, and it tasted like the first truth she ever learned. Lyrain said, "Pain can be a grammar for meaning." Elena Ward said, "Then let me conjugate survival." Outside, the fleet turned, and the court's engines murmured like a sea behind glass. Shade Primus said, "What you keep unbroken is the part they fear." The narrator noted how she straightened without moving, and the lamp seemed to bow. The narrator opened a corridor of memory where streets burned like pages, and Elena Ward held a stretcher that shook with every step. Sirens faltered into silence that felt heavier than noise, and ash landed like slow snow. Elena Ward said, "I counted heartbeats to keep the world from ending." A hand slipped from hers, and the night learned a new word for empty. Jonah Pike said, "Hold the perimeter, hold the idea." Marcus Hale said, "Numbers win wars, not feelings." The wind found its way through helmets, and fear steamed inside visors. Lyrian said, "Grief is a map that refuses to lie." Elena Ward said, "Then I will follow it until it ends." The narrator watched those streets fold into the present, like a knife sheathed in thought. The narrator led her to the quiet house that survived the blast, where light painted rectangles on a table that remembered hands. A photograph face down as if modesty could save it. Elena Ward said, "I promised a morning I could not deliver." The kettle scar on the counter felt like a small moon, pulling tides of memory. Archon Vale said, "Attachment breeds risk." Marcus Hale said, "Detachment breeds clarity." Lyrain said, "Love builds futures you cannot regulate." Elena Ward said, "Then call me a hazard." The whisper threaded the air with a chill that did not belong to weather. Shade Primus said, "What was taken becomes the lever you will use." The narrator closed the door softly, and dust rose like applause. The narrator returned to steel and shadow as a door sighed open, and Marcus Hale entered with law on his tongue. Marcus Hale said, "Confession converts chaos into credit." Elena Ward said, "Math will not bury a lie deep enough." A recorder blinked like a watchful insect, while the lamp hummed in disapproval. Jonah Pike said, "History remembers obedience." Lyraean said, "History remembers courage when obedience fails." Marcus Hale said, "Pathos is a currency that inflates and bursts." Elena Ward said, "Truth is deflation that leaves value behind." The corridor whispered with steps that did not choose a side. Shade Primus said, "They designed a maze and forgot you learned fire." The narrator measured the distance between their words and called it a battlefield. The narrator described a night that refused to end, and Elena Ward braided breath with resolve until they were the same rope. Engines throbbed like a distant ocean, timing the work of will. Elena Ward said, "I will carry the names until they grow louder than verdicts." Marcus Hale said, "Resolve without leverage is fragrance without fire." Lyraean said, "Leverage begins where fear ends." Jonah Pike said, "Fear keeps soldiers alive." Elena Ward said, "Fear keeps prisoners still." The whisper settled near her shoulder like a cold star. Shade Primus said, "Tomorrow they will measure pain, so measure meaning tonight." The narrator watched her close her eyes and stand taller in the dark she did not leave. The narrator marked the hour the trial truly began, as jalapenos bloomed like wounds that glowed. "Archon Vale said, the ledger of harm is complete." Elena Ward said, "Then show the hands that wrote it." The chamber cooled as if truth had a temperature. Marcus Hale said, "Relevance will not be derailed by sentiment." Lyraean said, Relevance without context is surgery with a hammer. Jonas Pike said, "The court needs clarity, not poetry." The screen stitched centuries into a banner and called it proof. Elena Ward said, "Where testimony is trimmed, motive grows." The gallery leaned forward as if hunger wore faces. Archon Vale said, "Proceed to cumulative intent." The narrator felt the air turn metallic when the word intent cut deeper than any blade. The narrator described a cascade of images where crimes were cut to fit a verdict. Archon Vale said, "Behold patterns beyond pardon." Elena Ward said, "I behold edits beyond honesty." A colony riot played with its captions reversed like a curse. Marcus Hale said, "Correlation secures intent." Lyraean said, "Intent cannot be borrowed from fear." Jonas Pike said, "Order is mercy in uniform." The gallery murmured as numbers swaggered like soldiers. Elena Ward said, "If mercy wears armor, who does it protect?" The data swelled until silence had to shout. Archon Vale said, "Silence confirms." The narrator watched Elena lift her chin in a room that preferred bowed heads. The narrator traced a seam where footage slipped, revealing a reflection that should not exist. Elena Ward said, "Freeze frame 47." The holos obeyed with a reluctant shiver. Lyraean said, "There is a splice inside the smoke." Marcus Hale said, "Artifacts occur in volatile capture." Jonas Pike said, "Artifacts do not exonerate bodies." Archon Vale said, "Proceed." Elena Ward said, "The timestamp is older than the building that burns." The gallery's breath staggered like a runner who saw the cliff. Shade Primus said, "A mask forgets its edges in bright light." The narrator felt the room recoil from its own certainty. The narrator counted the beats as challenge became indictment of the indictment. Archon Vale said, "Explain the inconsistency." Marcus Hale said, "Saboteurs tampered with archives." Lyraean said, "Tampering favors power, not prisoners." Jonas Pike said, "We cannot stall on anomalies." Elena Ward said, "Anomalies are where truth hides its keys." The hollow panels split like ice and showed metadata with bruises. Archon Vale said, "Call the curator of record." A drone drifted in with a voice that shook despite being metal. Elena Ward said, "Begin where your log stops." The narrator noticed that doubt finally had a sound, and it was a hinge turning. The narrator felt the chamber tighten as the curator's transcript stuttered like a guilty clock. The log admitted a purge window shaped like intent. Archon Vale said, "Irregular, not decisive." Elena Ward said, "Irregular is decisive when it chooses a side." Marcus Hale said, "Proceed to sentence regardless." Lyraean said, "Judgment that ignores fracture becomes fracture." Jonas Pike said, "We must finish what we started." Shade Primus said, "They built a verdict and hoped no one touched it." Elena Ward said, "I am touching it." The gallery wavered between spectacle and conscience. The narrator wrote the moment down as the first split in the armor. The narrator spoke as the sentence of extinction was delayed, not erased, replaced by a cruel test. Archon Vile said, "If humanity claims resilience, it will be proven in ordeal." Elena Ward said, "Then measure the marrow, not the shadow." Marcus Hale said, "Pain clarifies futility." Lyraean said, "Pain also clarifies resolve." The chamber shifted as shackles clicked and the floor opened to reveal a pit of trials. Jonas Pike said, "Comply and end swiftly." Shade Primus whispered, "They fear what will not break." Elena Ward said, "Then I will not break." The narrator described the silence that fell like iron sand, heavy enough to smother every breath. The narrator followed Elena Ward into the chamber of ordeal, where fire vents exhaled like monsters, and the floor was lined with shifting blades. Archon Vale said, "Cross and live, or fall and be ended." Elena Ward said, "If survival is your evidence, then witness." Marcus Hale said, "A corpse cannot argue." Lyraean said, "A survivor can reshape history." Jonas Pike said, No one escapes steel without surrender. Shade Primus whispered, every scar you carry is a rehearsal. The gallery leaned in with hunger sharpened by spectacle. Elena Ward stepped forward, every pace a rebellion dressed as motion. The narrator noted how pain became an audience of its own. The narrator traced Elena's path as sparks lit her arms, and the floor screamed with shifting teeth. Elena Ward said, every step is a name I refuse to forget. Archon Vale said, pain is the only truth without dispute. Marcus Hale said, the body will confess where words refused. Lyraean said, confession is not born of torture but of injustice. Jonas Pike said, this is discipline, not cruelty. Shade Primus whispered, discipline without justice is cruelty rebranded. Elena's body bent but did not fall, scars bright with sweat and defiance. The narrator said the crowd breathed as if her survival was theft. The narrator marked the shift when betrayal stepped into daylight. Ow. Marcus Hale said, your endurance is wasted, Elena. Elena Ward said, you would sell your own species for applause. Marcus Hale said, I would trade sentiment for survival. Lyraean said, survival without honor is an echo, not a future. Jonas Pike said, his words reflect reality, though stripped of grace. Shade Primus whispered, every betrayer wears certainty until certainty cracks. Elena Ward said, your certainty is not my sentence. The gallery gasped as Marcus's loyalty was bared for all. The narrator felt the trial change from spectacle to revelation. The narrator whispered that the ordeal ended not in collapse, but in endurance. Elena Ward staggered to the far edge, her breath torn but her spirit iron. Archon Vile said, survival is not innocence. Elena Ward said, survival is proof of what you fear. Marcus Hale said, fear is no foundation for mercy. Lyraean said, fear often admits the truth mercy denies. Jonas Pike said, she should have fallen, yet she stands. Shade Primus whispered, the truth has teeth, and you carried them across the blades. The narrator noted how the chamber filled with doubt for the first time, heavy as smoke. The narrator spoke as silence flooded the chamber, broken only by Elena Ward's ragged breath. Archon Vale said, your defiance is spectacle, not salvation. Elena Ward said, spectacle is the mirror of truth. Marcus Hale said, words will not outweigh history's weight. Lyraean said, but they can fracture the silence that chains us. Jonas Pike said, her survival unsettles order. Shade Primus whispered, order fears the voice that refuses design. Elena Ward raised her head, blood streaking her face, and the gallery leaned forward. The narrator said the air became a stage where a single voice could carve galaxies. The narrator traced Elena's words as they spilled into the void like sparks. Elena Ward said, humanity bleeds, yet it rises. We bury sons yet shield daughters. We carry scars but surrender nothing. Archon Vale said, scars prove danger, not dignity. Marcus Hale said, her litany is performance. Lyraean said, performance can ignite belief. Jonas Pike said, her defiance stirs unease. Shade Primus whispered, truth wrapped in pain burns deeper than blades. The gallery shifted, voices murmuring like a storm preparing to break. The narrator said, every syllable struck like a hammer against glass. The narrator followed as Elena's voice deepened into memory, her defiance woven with grief. Elena Ward said, I lost a home, I lost a child's hand in fire, but I did not lose the will to stand. Archon Vale said, such loss breeds recklessness. Marcus Hale said, recklessness cannot guide a species. Lyraean said, loss is the forge of endurance. Jonas Pike said, discipline dies in chaos. Shade Primus whispered, endurance frightens more than chaos. The gallery trembled at the image of pain spoken as prophecy. The narrator said her scars became banners that no hand could tear down. The narrator described the chamber cracking under words that cut sharper than verdicts. Elena Ward said, we rise not for mercy but for recognition. Archon Vale said, recognition is unearned. Marcus Hale said, recognition without surrender is fantasy. Lyrian said, recognition built on pain is stronger than conquest. You. Jonas Pike said, her voice spreads unrest. Shade Primus whispered, unrest is the seed of truth. The gallery erupted with conflicting voices, some demanding death, others whispering doubt. The narrator said her defiance planted fire where silence once reigned. The narrator marked the revelation that changed silence into shock. Archon Vale said, your lineage was never ordinary. Elena Ward said, my blood is not what frightens you, my voice is. Marcus Hale said, secrets reveal why fear is justified. Lyrian said, secrets reveal why resilience endures. Jonas Pike said, legacy explains survival. Shade Primus whispered, you are the ember they tried to bury, and now it burns. The gallery gasped as the truth unfolded, that Elena's existence carried the weight of a hidden legacy. The narrator said history itself bent as the chamber listened. The narrator said the gavel of stars fell when the tribunal returned, and the chamber forgot to breathe. Archon Vale said sentence stands. Extermination. Elena Ward said, then hear the last thing we will not let you bury. Marcus Hale said, end this page with clean ink. Lyrian said, clean ink cannot hide a torn page. Admiral Jonah Pike said, order requires a final act. The verdict sigil flared like a wound that had learned geometry. Hi. Shade Primus said, truth slips out when spectacle gets greedy. The gallery fractured into hiss and prayer as banners trembled in artificial wind. Elena Ward said, we are the sum of our dead and the promise of our living. Archon Vale said, rhetoric does not ransom a species. The narrator watched the room balance on a knife that pretended to be law. You. The narrator felt the first crack when a courier drone misfired and spilled private logs like intestines of light. Lyrian said, stop the stream. The feed ignored rank and painted the air with hidden edits. Elena Ward said, there is your seam. Marcus Hale said, contaminated artifacts mean nothing. Shade Primus said, they mean everything when they choose their victims. Admiral Jonah Pike said, who authorized this channel? Archon Vale said, silence that source. The gallery turned from judge to mirror as forged timestamps bled across faces. Elena Ward said, fear authored this record. Lyrian said, and fear has a signature. The narrator named the moment when conspiracy left its mask on the floor. The narrator followed the sound of doubt as it multiplied into riot. Archon Vale said, proceed regardless. The tears erupted, and factions shouted verdicts at one another like thunder trading ground. Elena Ward said, if law cannot face daylight, it is not law. Marcus Hale said, authority cannot be auctioned to noise. Lyrian said, noise is what truth sounds like at birth. Admiral Jonah Pike said, hold lines, hold temper. Shade Primus said, they brought a bonfire and called it order. Security rails rose, but belief moved like water and found every gap. Elena Ward said, you cannot erase us while we are speaking. The narrator wrote that chaos was simply clarity refusing to whisper. The narrator said the hidden architect blinked into projection like a cold eclipse and forgot to hide the knife. Shade Primus said, observe the author. A silhouette of shifting geometry confessed in fragments that sounded like pride. Elena Ward said, you feared what survives. Archon Vale said, identify this interloper. Marcus Hale said, stop this theater. Lyrian said, the edits trace to a single hand. Admiral Jonah Pike said, this is treason against process. The figure dissolved, leaving a trail of permissions that spelled intention. Elena Ward said, verdict written before evidence. The gallery inhaled the word rigged. The narrator felt the gravity of the room change as if a planet had been removed. The narrator watched the verdict wheel grind to a halt and spit sparks as if the machine knew shame. Archon Vale said, "Order must be restored." Elena Ward said, "Name the crime that was not forged and I will carry it, but spare the species you feared." Marcus Hale said, "Mercy after chaos is weakness." Lyrian said, "Mercy after truth is strength." Admiral Jonah Pike said, "Stand down and review." Shade Primus said, "History is listening with its pen uncapped." The gallery split into light and shadow, and for once neither side claimed certainty. Elena Ward said, "We are guilty of scars, but innocent of surrender." The narrator ended the act on a breath that sounded like a door unlocking. The narrator said dawn found the chamber bruised by truth, its banners hanging like tired lungs. Archon Vale said, "Proceed to restoration of order." Elena Ward said, "Order that fears light is not order." Marcus Hale said, "Clarity returns when noise subsides." Lyrian said, "Noise is what conscience sounds like before it learns to sing." Admiral Jonah Pike said, "Suspend force until audit completes." Shade Primus said, "They tasted doubt and discovered hunger." The verdict sigil dimmed, as if ashamed of what it had burned. Archon Vale said, "A stay is not absolution." Elena Ward said, "A stay is a door you will not close again." The narrator watched the court exhale, and the fleet hesitated like wolves reconsidering the circle. The narrator marked the hour a covenant was born in arguments that could have been knives. Archon Vale said, "Conditional reprieve under continuous observation." Elena Ward said, "We will live watched but not erased." Marcus Hale said, "Survival under terms is survival with sense." Lyrian said, "Terms must protect the sparing, not smother it." Admiral Jonah Pike said, "Draft oversight you can defend aloud." Shade Primus said, "Write it where sunlight reaches." Archon Vale said, "Any breach restores sentence." Elena Ward said, "We will answer for our acts, not for your fear." The narrator heard ink scratching in the air, and it sounded like chains pulled from water. The narrator followed the message that left the court and crossed 1,000 languages like fire-learning wind. Elena Ward said, "We carry scars, and we carry each other." Archon Vale said, "Know that lenience is not license." Marcus Hale said, "Comply and endure." Lyrain said, "Endure and become more than a verdict." Admiral Jonah Pike said, "Stand your lines with honor." Shade Primus said, "Speak as if time is listening." Elena Ward said, "We will not kneel to fear, ours or yours." The gallery stilled as worlds leaned closer. The narrator wrote that a voice once shackled now traveled farther than any ship the court had built. The narrator described the unshackling as quiet as snowfall, a sound made of breath and promise. A guard disengaged the locks, and the weight left her wrists like a tide going home. Lyrian said, "Carry the small fire." Elena Ward said, "I will not let it dim." Marcus Hale said, "History will still judge you." Admiral Jonah Pike said, "Let it judge what stands." Shade Primus said, "A warning is a road built from echoes." Archon Vale said, "We will watch." Elena Ward said, "Then watch us live." The narrator saw how freedom fit like an old coat, worn, heavy, and exactly right. The narrator walked with her to the viewport where the armada circled like thoughts that refused to sleep. Earth hung small in memory rather than in sight, and still it pulled. Lyrian said, "Go with care." Admiral Jonah Pike said, "Hold the line at home." Marcus Hale said, "Remember the terms." Archon Vale said, "We remember the risk." Shade Primus said, "The ember travels." Elena Ward said, "We will not be what terrified you. We will be what survived you." The corridor hushed as if the ship listened. The narrator ended where warnings become weather. Elena Ward said, "They wanted a verdict. What they got was a warning."